Ambassador Stuart Eizenstat has held a number of key senior positions during his decades of public service in 5 U.S. administrations, including Chief White House Domestic Policy Advisor to President Jimmy Carter from 1977 to 1981. He also served as a member of the White House staff for President Johnson. During the Clinton administration, Ambassador Eizenstat held several key positions, including U.S. Ambassador to the European Union. He also served as Special Representative of the President and Secretary of State on Holocaust-era issues and held similar roles during the Obama and Trump administrations and continues to do so in the Biden administration. Ambassador Eizenstat is the author of the book, The Art of Diplomacy: How American Negotiators Reached Historic Agreements That Changed the World. Joining Ambassador Eizenstat today is Moment's book and opinion editor, Amy E. Schwartz. Please welcome Ambassador Stuart Eizenstat and Amy E. Schwartz.
Hi, Ambassador. Thank you so much for doing this, for joining us, and thanks to everyone for tuning in.
Well, thank you
And
very much. My long relationship with Moment uh, continues, and that's a pleasure for me.
we appreciate it. And I wanted to also thank you for writing this wonderful book, which is, it's really I mean, aside from being a study of diplomacy and negotiation, it's really a great narrative account. I want to say almost a novelistic, character-rich account of a lot of turning points in recent history. I mean, I think of myself as reasonably well informed, but I found myself saying, oh, that's what happened at Suez. So I want to ask you, first of all, when you conceived of writing this book, did you think of that as part of the purpose? Do you think of it as partly a history book? How do you hope
Yes,
people will use this book?
yes. I wrote it for the following three reasons, Amy. First, during a turbulent and fraught time, when it appears that we have conflicts that are irresolvable, I wanted to show that over the last 50 years, we have used diplomacy effectively to resolve equally challenging problems and that we can do so again. Second, given the hot wars that are going on now in Gaza and Ukraine and those that we've lived through in our lifetimes, from Vietnam to the two Balkan wars in Kosovo and Bosnia, the two Iraq wars to Afghanistan to Libya, I wanted to take a hard look at how, when, and under what circumstances military force can be a complement and a supplement to diplomacy. And third, at a time when I fear that there is a growing isolationism of the kind that we saw between World War I and World War II, I wanted to demonstrate the critical importance of U.S. leadership in reaching these agreements and making a better world, and that if we retreat from engagement, that we will leave a vacuum that the Russias and Chinas and others with very different interests and values will fill. So those were really the three reasons, and I wanted it for several audiences. First, for diplomats, and having been one and having been an ambassador, it struck me that we go through language training and through the training of the history of the countries, but not any formal lessons on how to actually negotiate. In addition, I wanted it for those interested in history, like yourself, to elaborate how some of these historical events occurred. And third, I wanted it to serve as a lesson for the future, both in terms of diplomacy and military force, so that people could say, here are circumstances under which we can negotiate, here are circumstances with the military force, and if we negotiate, and if we use military force, here's how to do it effectively.
I want to go back to all of those arguments that you're making, and particularly, I'm struck by your comment that this is a sort of almost like the interwar period in the its drift to isolationism. But first, let me go back and I wanted to ask about you a little bit. I mean, you've had this long, eminent career doing all these different kinds of things. When you started out, when you were a young lawyer in the South, did you already have an interest in negotiation and international affairs, or did this all come, did you have any expectation this would happen in your career?
The frank answer is no. I mean, I grew up as a rather shy, retiring studious person in the public schools in Atlanta. I would have been voted by my classmates the least likely to get involved in politics and public affairs. And there were several epiphanies in my life. One was being at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill when President Kennedy gave a speech in 1962 in Kenan Football Stadium and challenged my generation to get involved in trying to make the country and the world a better place. And then that summer, right after that, summer of '63, I served as a congressional intern in Congress from the University of North Carolina and got to see Congress from the inside. The second epiphany occurred in 1968. I had worked a year in the Johnson White House after Harvard Law School, and when he decided, Amy, not to run for re-election, I worked on the Humphrey campaign against Richard Nixon as his research director, and I there met someone twice my age, I was only 25, named Arthur Morse, who had just published a path-breaking book called While 6 Million Died. And it was a chronicle using for the first time declassified Roosevelt records on what the president and his top aides knew about the genocide of the Jews and failed to act on. And it came as a complete shock to me. Our household, like so many Jewish households, revered FDR. He was like an icon. I joked that Jews knew three things during that era: Die Welt, this world; Jene Welt, the world to come; and Roosevelt. And so I literally said to myself at that time, if I'm ever in a senior position in administration, and I hoped it would have been the Humphrey administration, I'm going to do as much as I can to remove this cloud from the World War II history of what otherwise was a glorious history of our armed forces winning World War II. And that led me, when I was with President Carter as his domestic advisor, to recommend a presidential commission on the Holocaust headed by Elie Wiesel, that in turn directly led to the museum, which now, life coming full circle, President Biden named me to chair. And it led me down the course of Holocaust negotiations and other negotiations.
Right. I wanted to add, oh, no, go ahead. Finish what you're saying, because I want to ask about that.
That really is the sort of chain of direction. And I would never in my wildest imaginations have thought this would be the course of my career.
Wow. Well, it's funny how many eminent people can say that. It's just all comes out of time and chance. But talk to us a little bit about the Holocaust reparations part of your story. I mean, you say modestly in your introduction to the book that you say, I have not been a bystander to negotiations. And I think that's something of an understatement. But one of the most gripping parts of the book is the chapter about how you did work over many years negotiating Holocaust reparations of various kinds. Can you like tell a little bit of that story? What was that like, to do Holocaust reparations work?
So let me, if I may, take you back to the Iranian Revolution, because this is a little known piece, and that is I had recommended already that President Carter appoint Elie Wiesel and a presidential commission to have a commission on the Holocaust and make a recommendation of how we can honor the memory of those who died and those who still survived. Now, after that, we had the Iranian Revolution in 1979, in which the Shah left under pressure, and Ayatollah Khomeini, a radical Islamic figure, took over. I got a call in my West Wing office from Sam Khomeini and his colleagues, who were young students and young Iranian businessmen, of whom there were about 100,000 in the United States at the time, saying it was urgent that he see me. And he said, when I met with him, that the head of the Jewish community in Tehran had been assassinated and his body had been dragged through the streets of Tehran, and that if they were forced to go back to Iran, which they would have been under the president's executive order after our hostages were taken, it would be like a death sentence to them. So to make a long and interesting story short, I got an interagency group together and then got the president to agree that they would be exempted if they were Christians, Baha'is, or Jews from the executive order expelling all Iranians in the country. And second, got 50,000 Iranian Jews, Baha'is, and Christians out of Tehran when they could leave, and with instructions to our embassies and our consulates to give them special visa status. And that came from my Holocaust recollection. This was the first real opportunity to put in place the lessons of what happened when Jews were blocked from coming into the United States. So
Wow.
I wanted to mention that because it's a little known piece of it. Now the Holocaust piece came also unexpectedly. I was sitting at my desk in Brussels as ambassador to the European Union, and I got a call from a very close friend who had served with me in the Carter administration, and that was Richard Holbrooke of Dayton Accord fame with Bosnia. He was then Assistant Secretary of State for Europe, and he said that Edgar Bronfman, the president of the World Jewish Congress, had just come to see President and Mrs. Clinton to urge them to appoint a special envoy on Holocaust issues. With the collapse of communism, the fall of the wall, the reemergence of the tiny Jewish communities who had lived, I call them the double victims, under both Nazism and communism. And now they needed the physical infrastructure, synagogues, cemeteries, day schools, community centers, to try to rebuild their shattered community. And would I take this on? Now, I went to my staff at the U.S. mission to the European Union, and to the person, they all urged me in the strongest terms not to take it. They said, look, you've got a full-time job as ambassador to the European Union. It's a job and a half. It's one of the most important ambassadorships in the world. You don't have time to do another job dealing with restitution. I went home that night and talked to my wife, now late wife, Fran, and she said, remember the pledge you made to Arthur during the Arthur Morse experience in 1968? You've got to take it. And I did, and I went back to Dick, and he said, thanks, it'll only take a couple of months. Well, now I'm in my 20th year of doing it. But that's really how it began. And I was going country by country, starting actually with the Czech Republic and Prime Minister Klaus at the time, to try to get synagogues and day schools and community centers restituted.
Just to be clear, you're talking about these are getting them resources to
Getting
rebuild
the
that
actual,
already belonged to that really had belonged to them in the
yes,
past, getting their
it
buildings back.
belonged to the Jewish communities, and
Mm,
they've been partially destroyed by the Nazis and nationalized by the communists.
hmm,
Turned into office buildings and things like that, or just
right.
left empty. And had I only done that, this would have not even been a footnote in history. But then what happened was I got a call. I read a newspaper article, front page of the Wall Street Journal, by a reporter named Brian Pomper, and it was about something called dormant Swiss bank accounts. That is,
Ah,
bank accounts established by Jews to keep their savings out of the hands of Hitler in what was supposedly the safest banking system in neutral Europe, that is in Switzerland. And that after the war, if they survived or for their heirs to claim them, the bank said, we don't know anything about these bank accounts. We don't have such bank accounts.
hmm,
And according to the Wall Street Journal article, they did in fact know, and they just hid them. So I called Dick Holbrooke up and I said, Dick, you've gotten me into this property restitution. This is different, but it has a Holocaust thread to it. Can I do this and pursue it? And he said, well, if you have the time, go. So I went to Basel, Switzerland. I met with the Swiss Bankers Association. I actually took the Wall Street Journal article with me and I said, is it true? Yes, they said, unfortunately, it is. We have put our own ombudsman on. We've looked at every single account of every Swiss bank that existed between 1933 and 1945, even those that are defunct now. We found 732 accounts. We plussed up the interest to $30 million and we'll pay that. Well,
Hmm.
I didn't trust them. And so I worked with Edgar Bronfman, and he in turn got Paul Volcker, the former head of the Federal Reserve, who ironically we had appointed as the Carter administration as the head of the Fed in 1979. The head
So when
account,
is this? Give me a sense of what decade. This is in the early 90s?
this is now 1994,
Okay. Okay.
95.
So Volcker, yeah.
And Volcker was our Fed chairman in 79 and through the Reagan administration. He's the one that really solved the inflation problem in the 70s and the early 80s. And so we didn't trust what they were saying, that there were only 732 accounts. And Volcker spent, with his commission, using 4 American-based accounting firms like Arthur Andersen and PwC and Deloitte. And they spent some 5 years researching these. And Amy, there weren't 732. There were 54,000 possible accounts and 21,000 certain accounts.
Hmm.
And so that led to lawsuits being filed by a class representing the heirs of these people. And I negotiated with the Swiss banks and with the class action lawyers and with the Jewish organizations. And that was finalized by Judge Corman, federal judge in Brooklyn. And we negotiated a $1.25 billion settlement, not 30 million that they had originally offered. And a claims process was set up that lasted really 10 years where people could make claims. And for those families that were earless, where all the members had been killed in the Holocaust, Judge Corman set up a special program to allocate that to Holocaust victims.
Hmm. I'm remembering, tell me if this is part of the same story, but I'm remembering a time in the 90s when the Swiss published a list of names and they said, oh, we can't find these people anywhere. And one of them was the governor of Vermont at the time. Isn't that, am I remembering the same
It
story?
was Marilyn Kunin,
Adeline Kunin, yeah.
and she ended up being, ironically, ambassador to Switzerland. So
They found
when
her,
I
huh?
was doing this work, she was the ambassador. Well, then it became like peeling the layers of an onion back, because that class action case against the Swiss banks led to a massive class action, even larger, against the German companies, dozens and dozens of German companies who were slave and forced laborers. They used slave labor and forced labor, both Jewish and non-Jewish. And I negotiated a $5 billion settlement between the class action lawyers and the German companies.
Mm-hmm.
It also included the payment of insurance companies, payment of insurance policies. The insurance companies, believe it or not, had refused to pay after the war, saying that premiums weren't kept up with people who were in Auschwitz. So we got them to pay over $350 million. We also did the Washington Principles on Nazi Confiscated Art, which has had a remarkable impact. It was all voluntary, and people said, well, nobody will follow it. Well, it's, as Philippe de Montebello, then the head of the Metropolitan Museum, predicted to me at the conference. He said, this is going to change the art world forever. It's going to lead to provenance research. What's happened now as a result of that is that 5 European countries, Austria, France, Germany, Britain, and the Netherlands, have set up claims commissions to look at art. Thousands of pieces have been returned. In 2009, I negotiated with 47 countries, 44 countries were involved in the Washington Principles, on something called the Terezin Declaration, which clarified, Amy, that the Washington Principles #1 applied not just to public museums, but to private collections as well, and really critically important, that applied to forced and coerced sales. So oftentimes the Nazis didn't come in and just grab the art. They said, if you want an exit visa, you have to sell us the art at, bottom basement prices. And we make sure that got included. And that as recently as March of this year, 2024, with now 25 countries, I negotiated, along with the World Jewish Restitution Organization, something called the best practices for the Washington Principles, based on 25 years of experience of how to make them even more effective. And the ripple effect has been very, very interesting. So it's now gone way beyond just Holocaust art. So, for example, just within the last year, Germany has now started researching its colonial period. They've restored the famous Benin bronzes to Nigeria. The French and the Dutch are now looking at their colonial era confiscations, even though they're not directly covered by the Washington Principles on Nazi looted art. The impact of that has been really, really dramatic. And just within the last 3 months, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the largest in the country, with 1.5 million pieces, hired Lucian Simmons from Sotheby's. Christie's and Sotheby's set up their own art restitution staffs. They changed their whole consignment agreement, and they've resolved over 300 cases where if there's any cloud over it from Nazi year, they won't sell it until it's resolved. Well, the Met just took Lucian Simmons, who headed Sotheby's, to look at all 1.5 million pieces to determine if any of them have a suspicious provenance, whether it's Nazi era or whether it's colonial era or any other thing. And they just returned, the Met, more than a dozen art objects to Nepal.
Wow.
So this is very exciting to see the ripple effect.
Yeah, that's, it's so you're saying that of negotiations and principles that were established in what might have seemed like almost a one-off, a
Yes,
parochial.
and voluntary, mind you. These were
Right.
not mandatory. The only way I could get it done, you talk about the art of diplomacy, but we had 3 days of negotiations in Washington in 1998. And with the last day coming in the plenary, we did not have an agreement because they were concerned that the Washington Principles would override their own domestic laws.
You're talking to Germans and who's in the room?
Well, there were 44 countries involved.
Oh, wow.
Key countries were Germany, France, the Netherlands, Switzerland. And I got them in my conference room on the 7th floor of the State Department. And I said, okay, look, let's do this. I will put in an introductory paragraph called the chapeau, which says that none of these principles will override any domestic legislation. They're all voluntary. And that broke the ice and we got it done. Critics said, well, because it's voluntary, nobody will follow it. Well, it has been followed. And it's a good example that I make in negotiating that sometimes, Amy, many times, you have to negotiate for less than the maximum of what you want. A great example of that, well, 2 examples really, I'll review. One is at Camp David. Camp David, the president had hoped would deal with the Palestinian issue as well as Egypt, but no Palestinians came.
This is, again, give us the roughly the year. This is after the 67 war. Right.
Yeah, he refused to accept UN Resolution 242, Land for Peace, so they weren't represented. So it turned out to be only a bilateral agreement with Egypt and a vague statement about full autonomy for the Palestinians. But the point is, although it was a partial agreement, that agreement has held now for over 40 years, including during this terrible period with Gaza. The other example that I would use, and there are many others in the book, of being satisfied with sort of partial agreements and then building on them is the Good Friday Agreement that George Mitchell negotiated. And I interviewed 130 people for this book who were the negotiators of the Good Friday Northern Ireland dispute. Well, the British, in sort of typical British understatement, called the battle between the Catholics and the Protestants, the Unionists and the Nationalists, the Troubles. Well, the Troubles killed 3,500 people and wounded over 10,000. And George Mitchell was able to negotiate the Good Friday Agreement because he left two key issues for the future. First, and you would think, well, wait a minute, this is the most important issue. What is the future of Northern Ireland? Is it going to be part of the Southern Irish Republic or part of Great Britain? That was left to a later referendum, which has never been held because the people are satisfied with the current arrangement. And second, it was to disarm the militias, which were doing all the killing. They were Catholic, the IRA, for example, militia. They were Protestant militias. Well, it took 9 years after Good Friday before Tony Blair, who I interviewed twice for this book, got the decommissioning of arms. So I use this as an example that if you shoot for a home run in swing for a home run in negotiations, oftentimes you strike out. You need to get singles and doubles and then build on that for the next stage.
And you need ambiguities, right? Things that might mean one
Exactly.
thing to somebody and something else to somebody else.
Exactly. For example, the Shanghai communique would never have been done if there was too much precision over the future of Taiwan. So basically, the way it reads is that there's one China, and both sides agree that there was one China, and that the status of Taiwan will be resolved peacefully, but it didn't say which was the one China.
This is just to go back for viewers, this is the Shanghai communique between Nixon
Between yes, and that Henry
and Mao
Kissinger,
when they opened China.
And Zhou Enlai negotiated in 1972 for the opening to China.
I have to say that your description of that in the book is the first time I've actually understood the one China policy. You explained it very well.
Well, it's creative ambiguity, and that's oftentimes necessary in negotiations to get things done.
Right, right. Let me step back a little bit and ask you more about these principles that you describe in the book. I'm going to take you a little off the past. So you talk about these principles about ambiguity, and you also talk about a state of mind that's needed for real negotiation. Correct me. I think you called it empathetic disagreement. Is that the term you used? It's something like that.
Yes. So I set out a series of 13 principles for a good negotiator. And although the negotiations I describe in each of the 12 chapters, like Good Friday, like the Middle East, like the German unification and so forth, they're very different negotiations, but the skills that are required to negotiate them are common skills. And let me just mention a couple. First is to seize the historical moment with a determination to succeed, to know when history is being made. A perfect example of that is George H.W. Bush and his Secretary of State, James Baker, and Kissinger and Baker wrote the foreword and preface of the book. And when the Berlin Wall fell, they realized that this was an opportunity to reunite the two Germanies and to do so within NATO. This was an extremely heavy lift because all of the post-war World II allies who were occupying Germany, the US, with the exception, but France and Britain and the Soviets were opposed to reuniting Germany. Margaret Thatcher, who was then the prime minister, joked, "I love Germany so much, I want two of them." So they seized the moment, and they did a couple of other things, which are also principles, just to follow the thread. One is the necessity for developing personal relationships with your interlocutor. You can't see him as an adversary to be humiliated. This is not a poker game where it's winner take all. You have to have a win-win situation dealing with a sovereign country. So what Baker the Secretary of State did to break down the opposition of the Soviet foreign ministry to a reunited Germany, and certainly one within NATO, is he took Foreign Minister Shevardnadze to his retreat in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, and over 3 days, developing a personal relationship, talking about how peace for their children and their grandchildren. It broke the ice, and those personal relationships are really critically important. The second is the one that you mentioned. Larry Summers, who was Secretary of the Treasury when I was his deputy, called it a very interesting term, unsympathetic empathy. That is the
That's it.
ability
Yeah.
to listen to the other side and to put yourself in their shoes. What do they need? You don't necessarily agree with it, but you have to understand what they need to be successful in order to compromise. And here, again, let me use Baker. I give many other examples, and George H.W. Bush. So after the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, all of his political aides said, Mr. President, this is a mammoth political issue, which will help you greatly. You need to go to Berlin and do a victory dance on the wall. And he said, interestingly, no. Yes, there'll be some short-term political benefit, but I have to look at this from the shoes of Gorbachev. If I humiliate him by doing a victory dance, then I will not achieve diplomatically what I need to do, which is to get him to agree to a reunited Germany under NATO. And so it's that ability to sensitize yourself to the other side, to put yourself in their shoes, and to develop personal relationships, which is so absolutely critical. In my Holocaust negotiations, my relationship with Count Otto Lambsdorff of Germany, where he had a very deep feeling of remorse for what his generation had done during the Holocaust. And I could see from our interactions that he was deeply committed to resolve this. And no one believed, no one in the White House and no one in Germany believed we would get $5 billion, 10 million Deutschmark. But Count Lambsdorff was as committed as I was, and we developed an extremely close relationship. I had known him somewhat when he was economic minister in the Schmidt German government during the Clinton administration, Carter administration, but we developed a bond in the same way that Baker and Shevardnadze did. And those personal relationships, Amy, are really important in diplomacy.
I was going to ask you to take that framework and put it in a completely different context. And I'm just wondering, maybe this is just spinning daydreams, but are these principles things that we could use here at home to talk to our political opponents? I mean, should we be approaching people we disagree with politically with unsympathetic empathy?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, look, when I was in the Carter White House, I was his domestic advisor, and I spent an enormous amount of time in Congress on things like energy, airline deregulation, education. And so I negotiated already with members of Congress, and that gave me some insights for how to negotiate internationally. It is to look at a situation from the other person's perspective. What does that member of Congress in the House, or what does that senator need for his constituents? What does he need to take back? And we are, the old saw is a president proposes, the Congress disposes. Well, that is really how it works. Presidents propose legislation, Congress has to pass them. But if you only look at it from our standpoint and not theirs, you never get to first base. You can't just lecture and lecture and lecture. Yes, you explain your position, you explain why it's the right position, but then you have to find a way in which you put yourself in their shoes and say, look, this would actually help your constituents in the following way. This will help you politically in the following way. So it actually was good training for my international negotiation.
So, right, so I'm turning it around, saying people need to take these ideas of international negotiation and think about maybe this is how you talk to people you
Yes,
disagree
and
with.
in fact, one of the things that troubles me deeply about where we are politically in the United States, and again, I mentioned that in international negotiations, even with the toughest adversaries like the Iranians, if you look at them as your enemy, they're going to be your enemy.
Hmm.
What's happened domestically in the United States now is that we see the other side not just as political opponents, but as actual enemies. And the word compromise becomes a notion of weakness. You can't compromise with your enemy. But we can get nothing done. That's why we have such dysfunction in our government, because that mindset has set in on both sides too often.
Hmm. Well, you make a very interesting comment, I think, in the introduction, where you say that the kind of negotiation that you're talking about is completely different from, say, a business negotiation or maybe a real estate negotiation where there's a winner, where you finish a deal and then it's enforced by law and somebody wins. And this is a completely
And
different
you'll
idea.
probably never deal with that person again. Whereas
Right.
with with international negotiations, you're going to have to constantly interact with that country on other issues. What you may oppose China on in one area, you need them for climate change. You need them to deal with pandemics. So it's that interlocking relationship that is ongoing that's important. Another principle that I think is really important, and we can look at this from a school child's thing about doing your homework, and that is preparation. President Trump's trade representative, Bob Lighthizer, said I asked him what he thought the most important trait of a good negotiator was, he said three things: preparation, preparation, and preparation. Because knowing more than anyone else at the table is what allows you to reach compromises. And let me give you a beautiful example of preparation. So we're now in the 13th and last day at Camp David, and a negotiation which President Carter, I think it's the greatest ever done by a president himself, over 20 draft peace agreements. We were close, but not there. And Begin, the Prime Minister of Israel, comes to President Carter's cabin and he says, Mr. President, we're at Camp David. I cannot compromise anymore. I've reached all the compromises I can make. Please get me a limousine to take me to Andrews Air Force Base. I've got an El Al plane waiting to take me home. And President Carter, realizing that this would totally undercut the historic and courageous trip that Sadat had taken to Jerusalem, pledging no more wars, if he went back empty-handed, he could be assassinated, and that it would undermine his own presidency, Carter's own presidency. And because of preparation and reading in detail CIA profiles of Begin and Sadat, he remembered that Begin had a great love for his 8 grandchildren. So he gets his personal secretary, Susan Clow, to make 8 copies on the spot of the original photograph taken on day one when the 3 leaders came, Sadat, Begin, and Carter. And then he autographs it to each one of the named grandchildren, goes to Begin's cabin and hands it to him, and it was signed for Jimmy Carter with hope for peace. And he saw Begin's eyes tear as he vocalized each name, saw his lips quiver, and he put his bag down and he said, Mr. President, I'll make one last try for my grandchildren. Now that
Wow.
the preparation was really critical, as was, of course, drafting 20 agreements and being able to put yourself in Sadat's shoes, put yourself in Begin's shoes, looking at it from the other side, and listening. Listening is a crucial skill for negotiating. What is the other side saying it? Is it just a talking point? How are they saying it? What's their body language? And listening is also a critical factor.
Wow, that is a great story. I mean, that just that last big. Let
There's
me
another
yeah.
story to follow it up, which is everyone was against him going to Camp David. They said there's no way you can get Sadat and Begin to agree. But then the Camp David Accords were a framework for peace. They were not a binding treaty. And it called for a binding treaty within 3 months. Well, 3 months passed, 4 months, 5 months. Now we're in our 6 months, no agreement. So Carter, and I assure you, I'm not exaggerating, every single aide, the White House, Vance, Brzezinski, all were opposed to Carter going to the region. They said, talking about egg on the face of the President of the United States, you come back empty-handed, as you're likely to do, it'll be a terrible defeat. And he said, I have to follow this through. So we're now at the fourth day, and Carter has not reached an agreement. We're close, but not there. Air Force One is refueled. The airspace is cleared over Ben Gurion Airport. The staff is all almost gone now from Jerusalem down to Tel Aviv. And Begin calls and says, I'd like to see the president before he leaves. Well, we all thought it just meant thanks, but no thanks. Sorry, it didn't work out. So Carter had already dressed in casual gear, and he says, look, I want to, Begin is very formal. I want to put my suit and tie back on. Please entertain the prime minister while I'm getting dressed. So Begin comes to the King David Hotel, and he says, boys, this is a famous hotel. Yes, sir, we know that, say the aides. Well, not for the reason you think. When I was head of the Irgun, I blew this hotel up with the British in it. But don't worry, I'm not going to blow it up while the president's here. So he goes up to the presidential suite of King David Hotel. That's where the agreement is finally reached. And as they come down, Amy, the elevator at the famous King David Hotel stops and breaks between the first floor and the lobby. The
Of course.
Service agents have to pull Begin and Carter out butt first, and I call it the breech birth of the treaty.
An apt metaphor for how that went. Wow, that's amazing. So you've given me a segue to the question, I just have to ask. And I'm sorry to even ask this question, but it's irresistible. If you were negotiating in the Middle East right now, what would you do? I mean, what would you advise with these principles or other ways?
So I have a whole section of the book on the use of military force. What do you need to use military force? So the first is you only use it if all other avenues have been exhausted, negotiations, economic sanctions, a threat of force. Second, only if it's in the supreme national interest of the country, because there are going to be costs, there are going to be uncertainties. For example, I use a joke, but then an actual example. The joke is Mike Tyson, the former heavyweight champion, said, everyone has a plan until they go in the rink and the other side hits you in the nose. And that always happens in war. Unexpected things, like, for example, the Israelis hitting that soup kitchen humanitarian place, or in the Kosovo War of 1999, where we mistakenly bombed the Chinese embassy in Belgrade, and to this day they believe it was on purpose. So the second principle is make sure that you have a very good plan and that you know the cost. Third, and this is critical, it's critical for Gaza and critical for warfare in general. If you're going to use force, it has to be what Colin Powell called in my interview with him, decisive force, overwhelming force. And that's what George H.W. Bush used in the first Gulf War in 1999 when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. But his son, 12 years later, in the Iraq War, when they were trying to depose Saddam Hussein, did just the opposite. He used what his own Secretary of Defense, Don Rumsfeld, called a light footprint. And they divided our forces between Iraq and Afghanistan. And then last, and this applies directly to Gaza, and then I'll answer your questions, and that is It is supremely important to have good intelligence. We had terrible intelligence in the Iraq War where we said there were weapons of mass destruction and they weren't. I found out in my book, and I think it's quite a revelation. We all know now that there weren't weapons of mass destruction, but not the reason why. The fact is that Saddam did have weapons of mass destruction. But what was not known, and this is where it was a huge intelligence failure that cost Saddam his life and cost the lives of thousands of American young men, as well as Iraqis. And that is, he did have weapons of mass destruction, but he had destroyed them in compliance with UN resolutions. Why didn't we know it? Because he didn't want to admit publicly he had done it for fear it would weaken him domestically and that it would encourage Iran to invade. So good intelligence is critical, and we were the subject of horrible intelligence, as was Israel and Gaza. So, for example, in Iran, the CIA, 6 weeks before the Shah of Iran, our principal ally under 6 presidents, before he was forcibly deposed, 6 weeks before, the CIA reported to the president that Iran was in neither a revolutionary nor even pre-revolutionary state, and they didn't know that our principal ally had incurable cancer. So
Wow.
this is also the failure in Gaza. In Gaza, and I've gotten this, Dennis Ross and I chair a Jewish People's Policy Institute think tank, and several generals said that our biggest mistake was we didn't understand that Hamas had converted itself from a simple terrorist group that would send an occasional terrorist into Israel into a full-blown terrorist army, well-trained, well-armed, well-disciplined, hidden in 300 miles of tunnels, some 80 meters deep. Now,
Are you saying that's a failure not just of Israeli intelligence, but our intelligence as well?
yes, of our intelligence as well.
That's interesting.
So what to do now? Well, first, I do think that as terrible a humanitarian toll as has been taken, and there should have been more humanitarian corridors opened very early on, perhaps less use of heavy bombs, but I do believe that Hamas has to be disabled as a governing and military force. No sovereign country, including Israel, can have a group on its border in the form of a government that is expressly committed to its extermination. Now, having said that, as leading generals, including the IDF spokesman Hagari, said just within the last week, Hamas is an idea. It can't be totally eliminated. So it has to be degraded, but Israel would be in there forever trying to get every last one out. So we have to, and I think Israel is close to in phase 3, breaking them apart as a command and control institution. Now, here's what, again, I would suggest. One of the principles of warfare that is a lesson that I teach in this book is that before the first bullet is fired, you have to have a post-war political plan of what comes afterward. That Steve Hadley, the National Security Advisor, President Bush, and Condoleezza Rice, Secretary of State, in their interviews with me, were very candid in saying that was one of the huge mistakes we made. We did not have a plan for what happened after we deposed Saddam Hussein. Well, the Israelis, to this day, we're not talking, July 3rd, 2024, the Prime Minister does not have a plan for how you govern and administer and secure a post-war Gaza without Israel, which no one wants in Israel, permanently occupying it. So you must plan that in advance. And this is what I think President Biden is properly doing. He's pushing the government to do this. It's why Benny Gantz left the war cabinet, because there was no such plan. So I would really strongly press the Israelis to come up with a post-war plan. I would work as they're doing with the moderate Arab countries, and I would make an appeal to the public in Israel, because they now are very suspicious of a two-state solution. Israel's main security, we have to look at Gaza in a broader context. I've been to Gaza. I have personally been to Gaza as Deputy Treasury Secretary, and I'll tell you that anecdote in a minute. But Gaza is the size of Rhode Island. It's a tiny place with over 2 million Palestinians. And we need to put Gaza in a broader context. And here's the context. And this requires diplomacy of the first order, and the administration is trying to do this. Iran has its own coalition called the Axis of Resistance. It's the Houthis in Yemen, it's Hamas, it's Hezbollah, it's Syria, it's the Iranian brigades and militia in Iraq, to disrupt the whole order in the Middle East. Well, Israel has the potential of being in a counter coalition of all the moderate countries in the Arab world with whom it has already peace agreements, with Jordan, with Egypt, with the UAE, with Bahrain, with Morocco, and ultimately with the Saudis. But the price of that is going to be some horizon for the Palestinian state. Now, the moderate Arab countries are not saying tomorrow or even the next day, but some horizon. And this is something that the current government of Israel can't and won't give. And that's the tragedy, because without that, Israel's broader security, being embedded in this kind of coalition against Iran, will be impossible to achieve. And at some point, the Israeli public's going to have to make a very tough choice of whether they really want to go it alone and try to secure Gaza alone, or make it part of a broader coalition which will help rebuild and restore and secure and govern Gaza.
Do you think that that Biden and his team are doing a good job on this? Are they doing as well as they can, or do you see?
I do. I think they're doing as much as they possibly can. They're standing behind Israel militarily, and they're trying to rally the moderate Arab countries for this purpose. They're already thinking through what kind of a multinational force will secure Gaza after you weaken Hamas. They're thinking of, they want the Palestinian Authority, and I think that's a reformed Palestinian Authority, to take over Gaza. And that's something, again, that this government objects to. I want to give you an anecdote, though, that shows what could happen, and then bring it to where we are with all the campus unrest.
Okay, and that's good 'cause we're coming to the end of the hour, so that's
Okay.
perfect.
So I was the deputy secretary of Treasury in my last post, but I
So
was
give us
also
a year, give us a rough year. We're talking about 90, right?
This is now the year 2000 and 2000, the end of Clinton administration.
Okay, 2000, yeah.
And so I went in July of 2000 into Gaza personally to see the following. We had gotten Congress to pass something called a qualifying industrial zone, which meant that in those countries, like at that time, Egypt and Jordan and the Palestinian Authority, that had peace agreements with Israel, if you put a plant in an industrial zone in one of those countries, you could ship back your product duty-free to the United States if it had as little as 10% Israeli content. So I went to Gaza, I saw what was, and I'm going to use this term, beautiful. 30 plants employing 1,200 Gazans, a second phase of another 30 plants being built. And I went into one of the warehouses where they were loading the product on to a flatbed truck through the Eretz crossing. These were not Israeli companies. These were Japanese companies, European companies, American companies. And they loaded the product on a flatbed truck. It went right through the Eretz crossing to the airport. The Corps of Engineers, at our request, built the Palestinians for export. One unarmed Israeli soldier was overseeing the whole thing.
That was before the withdrawal, right?
Yes, and I went to see Arafat right afterward. I negotiated with him a half a dozen times. I told him about it. He said, look, I understand you have to tell your president not to invite me to Camp David too. And I said, why? And he said, I can't make the compromises that you want. And here's where I would like to close the hour. I went to Columbia before the second night of Passover with my son. We got in because we knew a professor did, to see what was happening. And I wish I could tell those students and those in other the following. 1937, the Peel Commission in Great Britain, two-state solution, rejected by the Arabs. 1947, UN resolution, two states out of the British mandate, Jewish and Arab. Arabs reject, go to war. Camp David, 1978. No Palestinians come because they won't accept land for peace. Camp David 2, 2000, okay, 2000, with President Clinton and Arafat and Prime Minister Barak. 95% of the West Bank is offered for a Palestinian state. East Jerusalem is a capital, rejected. 2009, Prime Minister Olmert and President Abbas, the current president of the Palestinian Authority, now serving his 60th year of a 4-year term. He's offered 96%, and the other 4% out of Sinai, and East Jerusalem is a capital, and 50,000 Palestinians coming back, rejected. 2005, Eric Sharon, a hardliner, pulls every single IDF soldier out of Gaza. And I wish we could show this video to every campus. 7,000 Israeli settlers forcibly removed by the army, kicking and screaming, out of Gaza. They leave the whole infrastructure, greenhouses and everything. Hamas wins the next election, takes over, and sends rockets instead of roses. That kind of knowledge is really incredibly important. And it's important as we negotiate, so we know who we're negotiating with. Hamas, you can't negotiate with an entity, a government that wants to exterminate you. But the Palestinian Authority is different. They do want peace. They signed Oslo, and the tragedy is that the current government and the prime minister has consciously weakened the very authority in the West Bank, which is willing to make peace at the expense of building up and letting Qatar fund Hamas. It's really a tragedy. So I think the Biden administration is on the right track, but it's a very tough road to hoe diplomatically.
Yeah, let me ask you one question that came in from a listener in advance. And this is kind of an interesting take on the diplomacy framework. This person steps back and says, are there groups possibly in the Middle East that think that diplomacy is just a Western mentality and that view the idea of let's talk as a weakness?
That's a good question. And the answer is no. That whether it's China, with whom you're negotiating, as John Kerry did, the climate change agreement, whether it's Iran with the joint nuclear agreement in 2015 with John Kerry, negotiations are necessary by all countries. Now, when you're dealing with countries that are not trustworthy, then you need something special. And let me really close it. This is really critical because we haven't talked about Iran. With Ukraine. And it's directly to what, because we're dealing with the Russians, exactly what your questioner is asking. Henry Kissinger said in his interview with me that you can't win at the negotiating table what you don't achieve on a battlefield. And that's why it's so critically important to make sure that Ukraine gets the arms it needs to get as much of the territory back as it can. There will be a negotiation to end this war when each side feels it can't achieve anything more politically than it can on the battlefield. And that's the tragedy of the 6-month delay in Congress providing arms for Ukraine. So now they have those arms. We need to make sure they have the most sophisticated arms and that they're as strong as they can at negotiating. I think that there will not be a formal peace treaty because we can't trust the Russians. I think what will happen is something like the 1953 Armistice Agreement that ended the Korean War.
Hmm.
It's not a formal peace agreement, but you have a demilitarized zone. Same thing happened in 1974 when the Turks invaded northern Cyprus. No peace agreement, but a line of demarcation. And I think that's what will happen here. Now, here's the key thing. And this again comes to the issue of trustworthiness with countries that you can't trust. You know what Ronald Reagan said, negotiate but verify. So if you're sitting in Zelensky's shoes, you're saying, now, wait a minute, you want me to negotiate with this guy? There's an old proverb that says, fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. Well, we've been fooled twice by Putin. First, in the Budapest Memorandum in 1994, when he got Ukraine to give up the third largest nuclear arsenal for a written commitment not to invade any more of Ukrainian territory, and then he broke it by going into the Crimea.
Hmm.
And then the second time we were fooled, we, the United States of America, signed on and quote unquote assured, along with Britain and Russia and Ukraine, that to end what was then the fighting in the Donbass eastern area of Ukraine, called the Minsk I and Minsk II agreements.
This
In
was it.
writing, the Minsk I and
Yeah.
Minsk II agreements, in writing, we assured, along with the Russians, that Russia, for the ceasefire, would not go any further into Ukraine. Well, what happens? This was 2015. 2022, just 2 years ago, 3 days before the invasion of Kyiv and of Ukraine, Putin says publicly, Minsk is no more. He totally vitiates it. So Zelensky's going to say, well, wait a minute. You want me to reach a peace agreement with people who will say they're negotiating but won't trust it? So we need to provide solid guarantees. We need the kind of 10-year security agreement which President Biden sought. We need it with other European countries to do. We need to make sure that they are members of the European Union, because even though there's no mutual defense agreement, it would be much harder for Putin to invade a European Union member. Perhaps we need to put NATO trainers in as a tripwire, but we need solid assurances, because you are dealing, this is the questioner's question, you are dealing with countries that, yes, they negotiate, but their idea of a negotiation is very different. They want an agreement, but then they'll violate it at the first order.
Hmm. Wow. So, well, those are sobering words with which to end this otherwise this very, very illuminating conversation. Ambassador, thank you so much for the book and for the conversation and for all this wonderful work you've done over your career.
Thank
And
you.
it's
I
lovely to
appreciate it.
talk to you as always.
Thank you.